Expo is a development framework that streamlines the process of building cross-platform mobile apps using React Native. It eliminates the need for complex native code setup by providing pre-built APIs for common device features like the camera and GPS, making it easier to access hardware functionality. It also simplifies the deployment process with built-in tools for building and distributing apps. Charlie Cheever and James Ide are the co-founders of Expo, and they join the podcast to talk about the framework and the problems it solves. Kevin Ball, or K-Ball, is the Vice President of Engineering at Mento and an independent coach for engineers and engineering leaders. He co-founded and served as CTO for 2 companies, founded the San Diego JavaScript Meetup, and organizes the AI in Action discussion group through Latent Space. Check out the show notes to follow K-Ball on Twitter or LinkedIn, or visit his website, kball.llc.
Hey guys, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Yeah, excited to have you on this. So let's get started and maybe have each of you introduce yourselves briefly, and then we'll get into the meat of the show. Charlie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'm Charlie Cheever. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, studied computer science in college, and then worked at Amazon and Facebook and co-founded Quora, and then took some time off and was so frustrated by how hard it seemed to build anything in mobile. And that was the only thing I was interested on, that I convinced James to work with me on Expo eventually.
Nice. And James?
Hi, I'm James Ide. Yeah, I've been working with Charlie for over a decade now on Expo. Similar feelings, like it was just kind of like the holy grail for every company. If you look to your left, look to your right, to be able to have one engineering team to be able to build everywhere. I've always been into building software for other software engineers, and that's exactly what Expo does. So it's been a great journey so far.
Yeah, so let's get into it. Do you want to share for our audience what is Expo at a high level, and then we can dive into progressive levels of detail?
Sure. I think like at the highest level, it just starts from this thought of like basically what James is saying, where like people have an idea of something they want to build, and how do we make it so that like it's as easy and as fast and efficient as possible to build that at like the highest level of quality that you actually want to achieve. And specifically, like the modern version of this problem involves attaching to like a bunch of surfaces, mainly like iPhone and Android and web are the 3 that we're focused on, because that's where every significant product that people build ends up needing to be on all those 3 platforms. And like we try to balance like trying to, we really start from this one code base philosophy. So you have one engineering team working on one code base. But we also try to balance that with respecting each platform and its differences, and sort of making sure that we're, it feels native to each platform and it is native as much as we can possibly do it. Would you add anything to that, James?
Yeah, another way to think about it is we want to enable engineering teams to build apps that are truly native while having a universal code base at the same time. When building for, say, an iPhone, we want to be able to use the iPhone's native user interface capabilities. It's a truly native iPhone app. And similarly on Android, we want to use Android's truly native user interfaces and build a native Android app. And on the web, DOM is the native UI toolkit, and we want to allow people to have pretty close direct access to the DOM, and React is a great way to achieve that. So we want to have native apps while also having a universal code base that one team can work on. And so that way, like say a product manager or designer doesn't need to go talk to the Android team and the iPhone team and the web team. They can just talk to the accounts team or the user profiles team and have one conversation. So the product is very coherent while still having native apps for each respective platform.
For an old timer like me, this sounds like what PhoneGap and that which became Cordova was trying to solve. Are y'all kind of similar to that, or how would you describe your relationship to that project?
I think that like a lot of what we wanted to do was born out of frustration with those, where there were so many great properties of the web as being this universal way to render UI across many places. But when it came to phones, it just doesn't feel quite right and doesn't have a lot of the little details that make using our phones like delightful in a lot of ways. I mean, you could see this where I think like a while ago now, but I remember a TechCrunch article where the headline was like, Mark Zuckerberg announces biggest mistake Facebook has ever made is building its mobile app with HTML5, is ditching that and rewriting everything in native. And like, that was maybe a little bit overblown. And I think there are times and places where, HTML is a perfectly fine way to render stuff, especially as phones get faster. But there are lots of things where like it just doesn't feel right or native to the platform in a mobile context if you're not using the operating system level widgets and you don't have a certain frame rate or level of performance, the gestures, the animations, the ways that you interact with it through touch. And I think the thing that we really believed that we had to push hard on to build was just that like we believed you could use technologies like JavaScript and things like that and achieve this, but that all the layers of, accumulated backwards compatible standards-based stuff that had built up in the browser over time, the implementations of, mobile Safari and Chrome as it was at the time and still to this day, they just weren't quite delivering the experiences people wanted. And you can still see this where people just complain about not native apps and and also I remember just talking to a bunch of startups and them saying like, yeah, we tried building a version of our app in web and it was great that we could move really, really fast, but qualitatively our users didn't really like it. Our stars in the app store and our, just feedback was worse. And also just quantitatively, we just saw, people not using our stuff as much. And so we had to go back to native or we need to when we have enough money to, or things like that. So we just wanted to solve that for ourselves as much as anything else. Like I really just, when we started working on this, a big motivating factor was just everything I can think of that's interesting to build is not just a website, but it's going to involve, an app on iOS, an app on Android, because that's how people use technology. Like if you think about how often, or just like how if you look at your own behavior, like obviously there was just this, when BlackBerry came out and then especially when the iPhone came out and et cetera, there are these jumps, but still there's been this like 15-year long journey towards like us using our phones and tablets for almost everything. And it's still crazy to me that there's still like 10 times as many web developers as mobile developers when our usage is now tilted probably like 70% to mobile as human beings. So a big part of what we're trying to do is just sort of correct that imbalance of like, this is how people show us they want to use software, but still as developers, we all like, our natural inclination when we start a new project is a lot of times to just be like, oh, a website is so quick and easy and it can get going really fast and there's all these tools and whatnot. And like, how can we make the tooling in mobile match that?
Yeah, that makes sense. So, okay, more emphasis on native technologies. If I understood correctly, digging into, because I'm not an Expo user, but I was digging into what you guys have. It looks like you're building largely on top of React Native on as sort of the development experience.
Yeah, I would say Expo kind of sits adjacent to React Native. It complements it. So React Native has a couple of pieces specifically. One way to think about it is it's a rendering engine that allows developers to kind of register native code, expose it to JavaScript, and also provides a lot of facilities really specific to React in order to get the benefits of the reconciliation architecture of React. And then Expo complements it being like a framework that kind of provides a lot of the developer experience that you'd want when using the React Native technologies.
So if someone were coming from the web world, would it be fair to say you're kind of like the Next.js equivalent in terms of a meta framework around the sort of rendering library?
Yeah, it's a pretty good analogy. People use that a lot. It's not absolutely one-to-one matchup perfect, but as in like broad strokes, like I think that makes a lot of sense for getting your head around it. It's a good way to explain it.
So because I like to geek out on this stuff, let's go into the places it doesn't match up. How are the nuances different?
One thing that jumps out is just that one thing that has been built out over time on the web is just that like a lot of the sort of widgets and things that you need are kind of available already. Whereas one of the big efforts that we put in is building what we call like the Expo sort of SDK or standard library, where we built like something like over 90 APIs that just are standard across iOS, Android, and in most cases web, and just kind of are well-tested, battle-tested, work across those things, and importantly, like work with each other. And so you can kind of just like trust that these are well-maintained and the APIs are going to feel similar and look similar, and like they'll all sort of work in concert with each other. And it doesn't mean you can't go use your own thing if you want to do like a big part of what we want to do is always let people have escape hatches, do custom stuff, do whatever crazy thing they need to do for their use case. But it just gives you this starting point of, sometimes people talk about it as like batteries included or whatnot, and just makes it like so much like your 0 to getting a product together that works can be way faster when you're not getting hung up on like, well, what am I going to do about the camera? What if I want to have haptics? What if I want to have vibration? What if I want to play a video? What if I want to like, there's so many things like that just like every individual developer was sort of having to work out those details on their own in a lot of cases. And then across mobile platforms and just having that, I think is probably the biggest difference where I think like the web has, on its own evolved a lot of that. And so the Next.js doesn't necessarily have that responsibility in as great a way.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So kind of providing not just the application framework layer, which is what Next is really focused on, is like, how do I build applications on top of React, but also kind of the phone abstraction layer of like, oh, phones expose all these capabilities. How do we use them productively in a React native based application context?
Yeah. But, just to call out some ways that things are similar, like I think one thing that Expo solves that Next also solves is sort of like this routing problem of like, okay, how do I take a URL and then map that to like a screen or some logical component of our application? And then how do I deliver those to people and organize them in my code base and also in my app and whatnot? And Expo Router is a big piece of our offering. And that's sort of an evolution of multiple versions of navigation stacks we've worked on over the last bunch of years. Evan Bacon, who's probably the most famous person on our team, is driven this forward and done most of the work on it. But it not only sort of solves the routing problem of like URLs to screens and whatnot, but we also have a tricky problem there of the way that navigation works on mobile phones is a sort of just different than the way it works in like web browsers on your computer. Where like on a web browser on your computer, you might have multiple tabs, but if set that aside for a moment, like you have a URL bar and then you kind of have one screen. Whereas in mobile apps, what we're used to is kind of like typical sort of app is, a tab bar at the bottom that each sort of is its own, kind of like a browser tab with its own stack and whatnot. But there isn't necessarily a URL bar. You just kind of like vaguely know that like the home tab of Instagram and the explore tab of Instagram and the profile tab of Instagram all have their own sort of navigation stacks. But the other thing is that like, that's kind of the norm in mobile apps, but actually every app has the potential to do it a bit differently. And sometimes you want it to be done a little bit differently. And then also things work a little bit different on iOS versus Android. And there's some differences there. And so that's been a really gnarly problem to get right. And then the other layer that we spent a bunch of time over the years working on is also that that's also one thing that people are incredibly sensitive to. And so, there's people out there who still will say like, oh, like I can tell the difference between a true native app and like something built with, any other framework by just give me 45 seconds of playing with it. What they usually mean is that they'll try to go back and forth and do some sort of navigation thing and, see if there's some little tick there. So it's one of the things that people are somehow, for whatever reason, incredibly sensitive about. So we've done a lot of work to try to lean on native stuff there and incorporate that and integrate that into our offering so that like we get to the point where people basically cannot tell that there's an Expo app or not an Expo app without sort of, having access to the source code or something like that. There are some rough edges that, we're not absolutely perfect on this yet, but that's kind of where we're trying to get to, where like, if you're using Expo app, it's like, it feels at least as good, perhaps even faster in some cases, because things we can do with multi-threading and whatnot. But I don't know, what would you add to that, James?
Just to go into more technical detail, like one option that the navigation libraries provide is for developers to use like the actual true navigation components provided by Android, provided by iOS. They're not replicas. They are exactly. So that means that when you update your phone to the next version of the OS, oftentimes in the fall, if there are subtle changes, those changes just get applied to users running the newest version of the OS with your app. And that means that we're not trying to like maintain parity. It already takes a lot of work to make something look pixel perfect, but it takes even more work, like sort of to use the iceberg analogy. How an app looks is the part of the iceberg above the water. How it behaves is the part below the water. And that's so much more complex. You can't just like look at it. You have to figure out like what are the hitboxes for all sorts of different components, gestures, animation curves, things that no one really wants to replicate. And rather than spend all of our time trying to figure that out, why don't we just use those components? Why don't we make Expo be the easiest way to use the components provided by the native operating systems?
I'd love to hear what abstraction you build around that for the developers, because I agree. Navigation is one of those places where it's not just the UI that looks different. The mental models are different, which is, I think, why somebody who's a longtime Android user, if they're using something that was cross-platform developed and developed by somebody whose mental model is more iOS, they're like, this is wrong. This is just wrong. So like, how do you expose those underlying differences in model to the developer building these applications?
A lot of it is just provided by using the native navigation controllers. However, some of it, like there are differences, like Android really has this concept of going back. And that's all handled by just keeping track of like more of like a global navigation stack. But yeah, a lot of this is just handled by the system already. I would say that just kind of to add to this, one thing that Expo brings to iPhone and Android apps is the concept of URLs really being a first class citizen rather than second class. So on the web, every page has a URL. That's just normal, right? When you build a website, like the URL is really a first class concept. On mobile platforms, just for historical reasons, URLs kind of were added on later. Phones got the ability to be able to handle URLs through things like deep links, but you have to write extra code to handle these URLs. What we want to do with Expo, and we've done this with Expo Router, is make URLs a first-class concept, bring together the best of the web with the best of native mobile platforms. And there are a whole bunch of benefits that fall out of this. One is that when you write an application, you don't have to think about adding deep link support. It's just built in because every page by default has a URL. So kind of going back to your original question, like what we want to do is actually figure out how do we take these like awesome like system integrations that Android and iPhone have if you were to add support for deep links and just make that be the default out of the box when a developer uses Expo Router.
I'm curious on that. So as you say, in the web, URLs are a first-class citizen. Some of the frameworks have really embraced that and used that as saying URL then drives your state that you're fetching, and therefore you can derive everything from that URL. Whereas other JavaScript application frameworks have sort of not been as key there. I'm curious, does your router then tie into your data layer in some way, or are those kept separate?
The data layer right now is fairly unopinionated. It is something that we are working through and developing, especially with React server components becoming more of the story for React, and also separately as like local first apps is kind of like more of a trend as well. So we want to be able to support both of those definitely. And yeah, so for the most part, like we just take kind of like a more URL and page centric approach. And while pages get rendered, like there are ways to sort of say, I want to, it's currently very experimental, but do like React server component logic or have an async component that does the data fetching, but it's very integrated with React, I would say. So I think that is an area where we're going to have to like explore some more over time. And so for now, we've been fairly unopinionated about that because we just want people to use whatever data fetching library, or maybe not even a library, they just call like the fetch API and should work. But over time, I want to kind of provide some more opinions around that so that in addition to sort of being like, to use the analogy of like Next.js, to also be more of like a Rails as well.
Diving in a little bit, so you mentioned you like to give escape hatches, and the Rails reminder is a good reference because they did a great job of this, especially as they matured, of like, here's the defaults for everything, but here's how you escape. Here's how you sub something in. What does it look like to bring in something that's not already an Expo API, but say you want to integrate a third-party package, or you want to build your own approach to some particular piece of this? How do you approach that within Expo?
Yeah, so the primary mechanism to do that is with what we call modules, specifically native modules. So let's use the example of like a native API that Google or Apple just added in the latest version of the operating system, and developers want to use it right away. And just we believe as a principle, it's really important. It's just really empowering, actually, when developers are their own bottleneck. They're not waiting for the Expo team to build a feature. They're not waiting for Meta to work on React Native for a new feature. Developers are their own bottleneck. And to a large degree, like modules, so we have a whole spec called like the Expo module spec. It's all documented on how to write modules in different types. That allows developers to define a module that calls into some native system functionality and expose it to JavaScript and have a bidirectional channel so that JavaScript can call into native code and native code can send events back to JavaScript. This works with not just like system capabilities provided by Google and Apple, but like really any third-party API that might be written in native code. So that's a lot of the surface area here.
Yeah, one thing that I want to call out that we put a lot of work into there is we sort of developed this technique in concert with Expo modules. We call it CNG for continuous native generation. It works with something called config plugins that like, maybe the easiest way to describe this is if you think back to like before package managers were really good for things like JavaScript and whatnot, if you want to use any kind of like C++ code and something, you often were like following 3 pages of instructions and installing lots of random build tools on your computer and like hoping you had the right kind of computer that the person who wrote the instructions had. And then, the worst case ends up being like you're doing multiple of these things and they're relying on conflicting versions of stuff and like they're stepping on each other's toes and you're being told to edit one config file and then another thing tells you to edit in a different way, but you aren't sure how to resolve this. Like, and you can see like there's so many gnarly problems as you go deeper and deeper and deeper into that rabbit hole. And so with config plugins and CNG, we basically made it so that like if you follow the spec and you implemented a config plugin for your native module, then you can just kind of add one line to your config file that's similar to like adding in your package.json in like a node project. And when you install it, what we'll do is we'll actually generate the iOS and Android project directories with all the native code there. And the implementation of a config plugin basically is sort of like a script that sets up and modifies things like your app delegate and your, plist files on the iOS side and your XML files on the Android side, and does all these sort of like annoying, tedious, easy to screw up or easy to conflict with something else type things. And so we have those automated. It actually has like some of the same properties of what makes React really great, where it's kind of like you sort of make the changes at the fundamental abstract level, and then the system kind of takes care of making sure that the whole world ends up in the right place for the user. And as you change sort of the fundamentals, the regeneration happens sort of as a re-render. And that means that like it's a lot easier to use these things and a lot easier to use a bunch of these things in concert with each other without having to go dive into all the details and keep track of a bunch of stuff in your head and have this very fragile code base, because it's kind of like constantly being regenerated from these sort of first principles. I think that's one of the things that is like, there are a bunch of little random things like that that are kind of 2 levels below the surface. And so like if it was born a software engineering podcast, it would be hard to explain that or get your head around. But those are the kinds of things that I think why the people who really like Expo and are big fans and longtime users, like classes of problems that go away. So you can put your mental energy and your time into like making the app you want to make, rather than like going on side quests to sort of solve, annoying problems that aren't even programming problems, are really the fun kind, but the more like Google a bunch of stuff, try a bunch of stuff until it finally works. And you're sort of like, I'm not sure why, but nobody touch this, please. Like
absolutely.
That's never very fun.
Well, and that actually feels like a nice entree into, so Expo is this free open source framework that handles a lot of these problems, but y'all are a for-profit company as well. And you offer the Expo application services, which make a whole nother set of those challenges go away. Can you talk a little bit about what those services are and how they relate to the core development framework?
Yeah. The most popular one that we have that a lot of people use is what we call ES Build, or our build service. And that basically just runs Xcode and Android Studio in the cloud for you. And like...
So wait, I don't have to mess with installing Android Build and Xcode to build a native app anymore?
Yeah. And so there's a whole bunch of reasons that's really good. One is like, if you don't have a Mac, you can't do Xcode. So like for people with Chromebooks, for people who are like maybe developing in web browsers at school, or for people who are on a cheap Windows laptop or things like that, this is one of the only ways they can actually, you could jury-rig your own.
I'm sold. Like, sign me up.
Yeah. Like a big part of what we do, I think, is making really good mobile apps accessible to like this really big community of people that are like basically like web developers or React developers, or people with sort of that skill set, and sort of shield them for the most part. Although, if you want to make something perfect, you usually do end up having to dive below the surface, but mostly shield them from having to deal with like annoying, gnarly stuff about building and whatnot as much as we can. And so, Xcode and Android Studio are both, multi-gigabyte giant downloads that often take a while to download. Like Xcode, for whatever reason, often takes forever to download from Apple servers. Android Studio has these sort of multi-part things where you download Android Studio, but then you're downloading like the specific images for all the different operating systems and things like that. And then if you're not somebody like, this is especially a big deal for like peripheral developers on your team who might be like not doing, native iOS or Android stuff on a daily basis. And so they maybe come back every 8 weeks to one of these things. And then this is kind of like, this happens to me with my PlayStation, where like I play it like twice a year, and every time I do it, it's
you got to
like,
do an hour of updates.
Right. And so before you can get going, and it's the same thing happens to people on your team with Xcode and Android Studio. So having it like properly configured in the cloud on really fast servers that like are sort of set up to work with Expo projects really well is just like saves a bunch of headaches. And then there's also stuff where you're like, when people are doing automated stuff, it's often like, well, whose computer are we going to run that on? Like, we're not going to tie up, Kevin's computer for however long, blah, blah, blah. And so it's just nice to have like a cloud that you can do that stuff on. We can also do some other cool stuff where we can just build for you, and then, you can download it and you can do whatever you want with it. But since we already have it on our servers, we can also do stuff like help you submit it to the app stores without having to download and then re-upload through whatever process, but just kind of, we have a service called EA Submit that is actually free, but just helps people with that annoying step. And then we can also, when you make builds, we can help deliver them to other people. Like one thing we're working on and improve, like this is a product that we have some parts of, but it's not fully where we want to be, is like helping everyone in your company or your project or your team or whatever get a specific version of stuff onto their device. With the web, these great services like Netlify and Vercel, like you can get Kevin.
This dev build, that dev build. Yeah. Absolutely.
And like in this way that's accessible to the marketing person, to the intern, to the product manager, to the CEO, or anybody on your team. It doesn't have to be, someone who's super savvy. And so it's a bit of a gnarlier problem on mobile because there's things like provisioning profiles and certificates, and things work different on iOS and Android, and you have to deliver native code builds, and like there's a bunch of gnarly things there. But I think we're sort of bit by bit working towards like as seamless and like easy as an experience for doing that kind of stuff as well. One other thing I would throw out there when I'm talking about the build services, we also did build it as I talked about how it's like specialized for Expo apps and works really well with those. We try to build everything in this way where we build it in a very general way to begin with. So you can actually run like kind of anything using AES Build. Like you can kind of build anything. It doesn't even have to be like a React Native app, basically. But then we put layers on top of it. So if you are using Expo, if you are using our standard suite of stuff, etc., your life just keeps getting easier because we sort of like say, hey, a lot of people are going to be doing this, so let's put other affordances in here. But we like try to not over specialize, because sometimes like people, we just find developers want to do all kinds of weird stuff. And it's so common that like a company has some we have to use this because we signed a long-term deal 5 years ago with a previous CTO, or, our, VP of Eng is friends with this person, or just for whatever reason, we have to use this or that. And that means that X and Y and Z have to be this weird way. And so we just want to make sure that we're always supporting that and giving people escape hatches, but also knowing that like, it's really important to take somebody who's just like, after you record this podcast and you have 45 free minutes, how can we get you as far along building like, your to-do list app or your pictures of anime scenes or whatever is interesting to you? How do we get you so far that you can experience something? And we sort of call that like fast forward principle internally. And I think it's actually super important because a lot of the success stories that we hear are like versions of something like this, where like I had lunch a while back with a team and they basically said, we're making sort of a meal kit delivery service. And so our priority is that we don't have a very big developer team. And so we thought that we could only afford to make a website in terms of, developer bandwidth and bodies and resources and whatnot, because it just seemed like hiring an iOS team and an Android team and keeping those things in sync would be way too much. But then one of our developers discovered Expo and over the weekend put together a prototype of what an app might look like. And they got so far along just over the weekend that when they showed the CEO on Monday that it worked on iOS and it worked on Android, and that they had like already built out like, more than half of all the screens we would need, and that the same developer team who is already building the website in React could, maintain this app and stuff. All of a sudden now we have these native apps that we just didn't think we possibly could. And so like helping people like stay on that easy path and go really far and glide really fast feels really important to what we do.
I love that. And I'd love to dive into a little bit of what that learning journey looks like. But first, I'm curious in this particular type of example, right? Say you have a React website, you've built it not knowing anything about Expo, and you suddenly discover Expo and you say, hey, I want a mobile app. What does it look like to kind of retrofit? Or are you building from scratch and just replicating screens? Like, what does that process look like there?
So being able to just take your React website and have it work, like create native user interfaces everywhere, is like the dream. And maybe that means you still have to like go dive into the Android and iOS specific code bases and tune them. But to just like have something working would be amazing. That is like directionally certainly an aspirational goal. Where we're at now is that some of the code would work. However, I would say it's the concepts that really transfer over. And also, parts of the code as well. So specifically, React code that is not coupled to React DOM, a lot of that would potentially carry over. Also, code like JavaScript or TypeScript code that does not rely on DOM or like browser libraries. So just say something like Lodash, I think was a really good example of this, although a lot of that's been like subsumed into the ECMAScript standard now. But those types of libraries, they do carry over. I think the biggest thing though that carries over is a team's like knowledge and expertise, the familiarity with React, the mental model of structuring your app in terms of these components, a lot of the data fetching strategies, those do carry over. However, as you mentioned earlier, like it's nice to talk about differences as well. And there are many differences with native mobile applications. Like one key difference is that typically mobile applications are installed on a user's phone. The expectations are that they launch extremely quickly, that they are available offline. Whereas on the web, typically you assume that the user has a very good internet connection, and otherwise they wouldn't have been able to load the website in the first place, setting aside a couple of like offline PWAs. So there are differences in the mental model too. However, like going back to similarities, you would be able to like take a lot of your React knowledge. And several companies, what they do is they break their code base out into shared pieces. And then over time, if they so choose, they may even gradually migrate their website to use technology like Expo's web support, which also works with React Native Web is the library, which is kind of like giving you a way to call into the React Native API and have that render to DOM components. And just to give shout outs to a couple of projects in this space, specifically from Meta, there are two projects. One is called StyleX, which is a way to express styling that uses CSS on the web, but also uses kind of React Native compatible styling libraries for Android and iOS. And the other is called Strict DOM. So React Native uses a lot of components called like view and scroll view and text view. Instead of doing that, what Strict DOM does is it provides a subset of DOM components like, say, div and span that we're all familiar with, and allows developers to call into those components and have them work on React Native. So I would say overall, the ecosystem is gradually moving in this direction, and it's still like aspirational, but every year there's more progress in that way.
Yeah. Another way I think about it is like in stories like the one I told you of this meal kit app, I think when they start out, the code base is probably pretty separate. I would imagine something like 10 to 20% of their code was shared. And it was just sort of like another kind of React app, but sort of developed in parallel. And over time, people that try to share more code can get up to something like 70, 80, maybe 85% over time. And then there's another kind of app that like, if you start from the very beginning with this idea of like one code base and using Expo's web support, there are apps that basically like, it's basically 100% shared with some specialized stuff that says like, on Android, there's something specific I want that's just an Android specific thing. And so like that code doesn't make sense to be shared because the whole point is that it's specific. And so a great example of that would be like Blue Sky, which is this, Twitter alternative, basically. I'm not sure if that's the way they'd like me to describe it, but it's really cool. It's really alive. It's got 10 million users. It feels awesome, actually. Like I use it every day. The iOS app feels really great. It's just like a native iOS app. I don't really notice the difference between it and Twitter. It feels basically just as good to me. Android app feels native. And the website also is really good. And it's all one code base, all started by one guy who didn't even have React experience before, built it by himself in a couple of months. And now there's a bigger team working on it and they've polished it and it's gotten a lot better. But that kind of product is actually really inspiring to us and really awesome because like over time, we originally saw that like our original thought was like, there's two problems. There's iOS and Android. Those are two problems. And we can collapse those two problems down into one. That'll save people a whole bunch of time. That was true. But then we kept finding that like, if you go look around, so like United Airlines is like an app that I end up using a lot because they have a hub in San Francisco. And their mobile website is basically the same product as their iOS app. And their iOS app is basically the same product as their Android app. And I actually don't know exactly how their whole tech team is structured, but like just from looking at it, I'm pretty sure that it's like they have one product manager and design team that then farms out specs to like an iOS implementation team, a web implementation team, and an Android implementation team. And it's pretty good. Like, I don't actually have any problems with it. I think it's one of the better airline apps, and they do a good job. But like, how annoying is that you have to have these like 4 groups working in concert, and then these 3 people not only trying to do their own work, but trying to like stay in sync with 2 other sets of people doing the same work. And if you want to add something or change something, whatever, and then whenever there's differences, then imagine like trying to deal with your customer support, and the customer support has to say, well, what platform are you on? They're like, oh, that's because this only happens on Android or whatever. And they're just like, you don't want those differences, like for 20 different reasons. And so, I think there's something incredibly empowering that goes beyond just that like first order savings of like, oh, we don't have to do it 3 times, but like the automatic keeping in sync and that tightening of that loop so you can iterate faster and you can move faster. I think it's just a really big deal for anyone building stuff. And, another thing that like is really exciting to me now is that like, I sort of said, okay, we start off with 2 problems and we collapse them into 1. And then we started talking to people and I was like, oh, there's actually this 3rd problem, which is web. No, we collapse all those 2 problems in 1. And now with React server components, it's almost like there's this other problem, which is we talk to people about why they use Firebase or they used to use Parse. They would say, oh, well, I was told I need to add a checkbox to the email page because we have to let people unsubscribe from all emails. And so I went and implemented the checkbox, but then I had to, file a ticket with the backend team to add to their, next Scrum sprint that they, add a database column and then, blah, blah, and give me an API I can call. But I just needed to get this done because the CEO told me to. So I just decided to store it in Parse or in Firebase in the cloud and just directly call into it. And so like, you can see that there's this thing where like, if backend and front end are separated, you're breaking the tightness of the loop and it's really inefficient. And so we're really excited about like, people use JavaScript and servers now. And so like letting you like write this all as one code base that sort of like one team can tackle and balance. And so you're like the sort of shipping the org chart becomes less of a problem because the whole org is working on the whole product in a very holistic way in concert.
Yeah. I feel like we're definitely trying to move in that direction. And there's a variety of things leading towards the ability to just kind of have the same people. It's all one product. Let's have them all working together. So love it. Love the direction. I'm curious then, if someone's wanting to get started building with Expo, what does the learning journey look like? Where do they get started? What are the most common like gotchas or rough edges? Like, how should somebody who's interested, who's listening, has never touched Expo, what do they do?
Well, we have this new website called expo.new, which is designed to be the landing page for people who want to just start building a new application. Actually, Charlie worked most closely with a lot of the engineers on this project. You can probably give the best description of how this works.
I think it's not too different than creating a React web app in a lot of ways. And that like what we are currently most optimized for is basically like you are a developer who knows React or at least knows React a little bit or knows enough about it to vaguely be dangerous or learn it quickly. And so you typically will do something like create Expo app. I'd recommend you start with Expo Router because I think it really sets you up for success in a whole bunch of different ways. And then like with anything, like you want to just build something that you'll feel like, oh, I accomplished something. And that'll like keep you motivated. There's actually one of the things that's a real stumbling block for people is one thing that's awesome about the web is that like if you want to teach a kid to make a website, they already have the web browser on their computer. And so if they make an HTML file, they can just open that in their web browser. And like you can get them into this thing where they're like making changes and seeing them happen and like all this other stuff without having to go follow many pages of instructions to install this and wait for that, et cetera, et cetera. The tricky thing about mobile is that like, first of all, you've got multiple devices. So you're usually like typing on your computer and writing your code on there, but then the real experience you probably want to have on your phone because gestures and animations are so important and maybe you need to use the camera. There's all these reasons that like being on a phone is good. But to do that, you generally need to have a build. And so then that's one way that EAS build comes in handy is that like we can at least do a build for you and sort of get you going pretty quickly that way. And so if you go to expo.new, you have a bunch of different options, but a lot of the flows will take you to sort of use EAS build, and we have a free tier, so you don't have to crack open your credit card or whatever right away. But like, you can do a build and get it onto your iOS device, your Android device. And so you're not just limited to developing in the web browser to start. We also have a middle ground option where if you're only using modules from the sort of standard library or Expo SDK, you're talking about you're not using any custom native code, which is most things that get to be real production apps need some custom native stuff to be exactly what they want to be. But a lot of things can get pretty far without doing any custom native stuff. So especially at the beginning, one thing that people like to do is use this app that we put in the App Store called Expo Go, which is sort of like development browser for native. Like you can't go browse other stuff with it because Apple doesn't really allow that. You can open your own projects basically in the way that you might open a web browser. So you can scan a QR code that comes up in your terminal and it'll just like open up your code base, bam, keep going. And so like, this is awesome for a bunch of reasons. Like if you find an example project for like, shopping list app or something that somebody's put on GitHub, you can just clone that, then fire it up, and then open an Expo Go and like skip that process of doing a build. And so like if you just want to check something out quickly, but like if you're putting your app in the App Store that's going to reach 20 million people and it's going to make you millions of dollars, then like waiting 15 minutes or 10 minutes for a build, no big deal. But if you're just trying to check out a project and see how it's built and like you only have 10 minutes in between meetings, just being able to open something in Expo Go really, really quickly is actually a big deal. So we try to give people a lot of options along the way to just speed up their journey in different ways, while also trying to balance that with like trying to have one fairly straightforward path so that people don't get kind of in the way that Rails keeps you on Rails, but lets you go off in different directions. We're inspired a lot by projects like that.
Question about Expo Go, and this ties a little bit. So I saw one of the service offerings you have is things that are JavaScript layer updates. You can help somebody using the Expo application services to ship things live over the web, but things with native updates need to be deployed through the App Store as updates. Does Expo Go have those same limitations, or is it able to give you access to a project that has custom native pieces?
Yeah, basically the same limitations. So like you can think of Expo Go as like just an app that has all of the Expo modules in it and nothing else. And so if you want to use anything else, either it has to sort of degrade and like, so maybe you have like a black rectangle where it's just like, this just doesn't appear here or whatever, or it just doesn't work and you just have to do it. So we have a solution there as sort of a middle ground that we've been pushing people more and more to, because I think for a lot of situations, it's sort of a best of both worlds type thing. We'll make something called, or you can do this locally, on your own machine if you prefer. We'll also do this in the cloud for you if you like, but we call them like development clients. And that's basically sort of like your own version of Expo Go just for your app with whatever modules you need. And also, your app's icon and your whatever other kind of like weird operating system level things. Like if you're using Apple Pay and you have to have, certificates baked in there or whatnot, you can make sure all those things are right in a way so that it actually is a much closer experience to what your app is going to be like when it enters the App Store and things like that. And one of my like core beliefs as a developer, I don't know, core beliefs is a little strong, but like one thing I believe as a developer is just like, you always want to have your development environment be as close to production as possible, because whenever there's differences, there's a potential to come back and bite you. And so the thing we really like about development clients, and the reason that like we prefer them, and we've been nudging people in that direction instead of telling them to use Expo Go, is just because it gets you, 70% closer to production than hand waving at that number, obviously, but like they're just a lot more close to production than Expo Go is. And then the one big downside is that like, you have to do a build. And so either you have to have a computer and it takes some time, or you have to do it in the cloud and it takes a couple of minutes. And if you're in a big hurry, or you're just trying to like, if you're saying you're trying to teach somebody how to use Expo, you're trying to get a whole class of 20 students or something like that, Expo Go is great for that because they can download from the App Store. It's very straightforward. And if you don't need any custom native modules, then like it's like a very generalized, generic, limited development client, basically.
Well, we've talked about a bunch of different stuff, and you sort of hinted towards things that are going to connect to this sort of closing question. But looking forward at the next year or couple years, what's coming next for Expo? What are the things that you're really excited about that are on the horizon? I know we've talked about some things that are like the long-term vision, and that's great. But like if somebody's looking at this and saying, okay, what's going to be there in 2025? What do I have to be really excited about? What would you call out?
We've got several things, but kind of to touch upon some topics that we've talked about earlier during this podcast. One is React Server components. The idea of rendering some of your components on a server, and not just with like server-side rendering, but rather components that can directly call into server-side APIs. Potentially, they're calling directly into a SQLite or Postgres database. Maybe they're making a call into an AI service with private keys, or you're looking at processing payments through something like Stripe, for instance. These are all instances of code that needs to run on the server, and being able to like kind of more cohesively put that code with your React code is one of the things that React Server Components lets people achieve. So that is one area of focus, and we want to like provide a whole solution for developers to be able to take advantage of React Server Components across all the platforms we support. Another kind of more on the development side is like Charlie had talked about how we have this fast forward principle at Expo. The idea that we want to build general, very powerful infrastructure that has really high ceilings. And then on top of that, we want to build solutions that let developers fast forward past all that complexity when they don't need it and provide really good defaults. Going back to having a really generalized base infrastructure layer, that allows us to provide services more than just builds. And so what we want to do is allow developers to bring their own tasks, self-host your own kind of CI/CD pipeline as part of the whole infrastructure. We've heard stories from many developers who will run some of their CI/CD on one service, and then they call out to EAS to do their builds. Meanwhile, their other CI/CD service is just waiting for the build to finish, and they've almost just begged, said, can we please just run everything on EAS? So we think that is just a natural evolution of some of our build infrastructure as well. So those are two concrete things that I think developers can look forward to in the next year.
The one thing I'd add to that is just like we really are making good progress towards that dream that we're talking about, where we're really unified with web, and web developers can come over and just get going right away and be using so many of the things that they're familiar with, but getting native components out of it so that like when they're writing stuff that feels familiar to them, they're just getting a native app on iOS and native app on Android. I think we won't fully get there in 2025, but we're going to make some big leaps towards it.
Amazing. Well, this has been super fun. I've really enjoyed diving into this. I have never tried actually using Expo before, but I am excited to. As I said, my mobile days date back to like Cordova and dealing with things in that space. And I've been pretty web focused recently, but this sounds like a great toolkit. And I'm very jazzed by the stuff you're doing. And unlike a lot of companies that have an open source component and a services component, like your services make so much sense for building in this ecosystem. They don't feel tacked on, right? They feel like, oh, it makes sense why you're offering this and why it costs money, because it requires infrastructure. So just super cool stuff. Any last thoughts you want to leave folks with before we wrap up?
One thought I have is that like we really want to work together with a lot of others. Of course, that can include engineers like joining Expo, but also like at other companies and partnering together. Like it's going to take a lot of companies, people working together to build the new default way to make software that just works everywhere. So if any of the listeners work at companies where you think it might make sense to team up and partner with Expo, like, yeah, we'd love to do that.
Yeah. And kind of the same vein, I was just going to tack on a shout out to the 1,600 open source contributors that fill out the dark corners of the project where they run into a bug, they run into something gnarly, and they fix it, send a PR to us, and we incorporate it. That makes the project so much better. So thankful to have the community participating and making this really good.
Awesome. Well, Charlie, James, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Kevin.